What is up with all of the conversation and questions about does Chad Daybell's house have stairs? It's ridiculous. Let's get into it. Today I am going to be covering days 13, 14, and 15 of the Chad Daybell trial. That is April 29th, May 1st, and May 2nd. You'll notice that April 30th is not in there. Tuesday. That is because court didn't happen that day. There was a memorial for an officer who died in the line of duty, so court didn't happen on Tuesday. So we're going to just book it through Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday to get you all caught up on what's going on. And a lot is going on. So welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I am your host, Annette Lyon, woman of faith, true crime junkie, and USA Today best-selling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole bunch of other stuff. Day 13 began with FBI Special Agent Nick Balance. He went into all kinds of information about cell tower data and pings and towers, sectors, and all of this stuff. He's part of the CAST team, which analyzes cell tower things, and at one point prior went all over the place, almost implying that the FBI is trying to frame Chad and kind of saying, how are we supposed to trust you with this data because this thing you're using is not available to the public. And Special Agent Balance tried to explain, okay, the data is available to the public. We happen to have this tool, this software that helps us analyze it more easily. You could do it yourself. That software is only available to law enforcement, not just the FBI, but any law enforcement. And if you know much about FBI and retired FBI special agents, you know that oftentimes they retire and then go into some kind of business as a second career that would help law enforcement in a way that they understand from firsthand experience would be useful. It's not nefarious, people. It's a tool. And it's just something that makes their job a little bit easier, for crying out loud. But yes, a lot of the testimony was kind of dry, but it was important. It placed Alex on the Daybell property and Lori and Chad communicating with each other right when it's pretty clear that JJ's body was being buried. A vehicle going onto Chad's property, stopping right there where the body was found. It's pretty damning evidence. We talked a little bit more about their son Mark and his mission. They mentioned zone conference, that Mark had his own conference. What that is so every mission gets divided up into zones, into these chunks, and then roughly every 6 weeks-ish, they have a conference. They get together for training and whatnot with their leaders, the mission president and his wife, assistants to the president. And they have there's sister leadership people. There's a whole bunch of people who they get together. But essentially, it's just roughly every 6 weeks, the missionaries in your area will get together and go through some training. Essentially, we're talking about calling home, and there were some times where it sounded like Chad wasn't going to be available to talk to Mark when he was calling, and that is significant. So, as I mentioned in the last video, policies have definitely shifted toward the better, in my opinion, in recent years. In the 80s, and even actually up to when my oldest went on his mission, you could call home 2 times a year, on Mother's Day and on Christmas. That was it. Unless there was like some big emergency or whatever, there was no phone contact other than those basically an hour twice a year, and that was brutal. It was hard. And fortunately, in my era, they started out with Skype. We were at least able to do video calls, and then we were able to exchange emails once a week. When my second missionary went out, it was halfway through her mission where the policy changed, where instead of calling twice a year, you could call every single week on your P day, which is preparation day, and they would try to keep the call to about an hour. And it was supposed to be immediate family, At first, when the announcement came out, my daughter was even going, whoa, I don't know if I like this, because I'm trying to stay focused on the workout here. And the next thought was, maybe my parents need it. Maybe mom needs it. And, honestly, fair. And I'm pretty sure that, let's see, when Tammy passed away, yeah, the policy had changed by then, I'm quite sure. But the fact that Chad didn't make time for her son to call, that he would make sure he was available. Every other mission parent that I know, me, my husband, all my friends, when they've had a missionary out and the phone call comes, the world stops. Like, you answer that phone no matter where you are, and you are going to be talking to your missionary for as long as they can. That's, it's the way it is. And you want to hear your kid, and you want to see their face, and you want to hear their tone, and you want to see their eyes and know how well they're doing, and that kind of thing. And just another little side note here. This is me getting on my soapbox. I made the mistake, apparently, on social media recently of just suggesting the people not to be cruel to missionaries. And I got just blasted for that, saying that I am sending my children out, and how dare I do that? If it's a hard thing, I shouldn't be sending my kids out. And I wanted to go, number one, they were adults. They made that call. They made that choice, whether or not I wanted them to go. You support your kid, and you just hope people aren't cruel and mean to them as they're doing something that they feel is the thing that they are supposed to do. And as they're still very young adults, they're barely adults, and people can be cruel. So I didn't think that was a hot take to say don't be a jerk to young adults. You don't have to invite them into your home and let them teach you. But just don't be cruel, just don't be a jerk. That's seriously a hot take to anybody. Let's just not do that. Okay. Back to the case. We learned that Chad told Tammy that he was going to speak at a girls' camp, which is every summer, the young women ages 12 to 18 have like a wilderness type experience for anywhere from 2 days to 5 days, something like that. Sometimes it's on a ward level, so you'll go just up a canyon and spend a couple nights there. Sometimes it's on the stake level. Depends on a lot of different factors. It's supposed to be a time to get away from society and be like passing like certifications, almost like Boy Scout type things, learning how to tie knots and start fires and with steel wool and that kind of thing. First aid. They've kind of phased a lot of that out. Let's have bonding experiences and spiritually uplifting speakers and songs and that kind of thing. So supposedly Chad was going to Texas to speak at a girls' camp. In reality, he was meeting Lori in Texas for his affair. I'm glad that at least Pryor isn't trying to hide the fact that there was an affair. He actually called it that this week. It just pisses me off on so many levels. Pryor has talked about, these meetings that have women, all women, and then there's also this girls' camp thing. And it was unclear at one point which he was referring to, because he called something a girls' meeting. And I thought, okay, do you mean girls' camp? Or are you being a misogynistic jerkwad as usual and referring to women and calling them girls? In which case it would be the Relief Society. That's the women's organization. And as the name implies, it was begun way back in the 19th century as an organization to help and serve other people who are in need. The Relief Society. That's where the name comes from. And that was the initial purpose of it. Thursday at one point, he actually called it the High Society. And I wanted to go, no. In fact, if you know like the history of Relief Society and the kinds of activities they do, it's like, we're pioneer women, let's learn how to can. This is not high society. We had Hannah Parker Munoz testify. Her mother is Tammy's cousin, and apparently, so her mother is Patricia. Patricia and Tammy grew up very close in California, and then their families both ended up in Springville. And she said it was almost a sisterly relationship. They were very tight. And she was very sad when the Daybells moved to Idaho. Of course, they kept in touch, but not as frequently or as regularly as they had before. So Hannah and her mother, Patricia, both testified. Hannah testified first that she went to the viewing the night before the funeral. And that version of the story was different from what we've heard up to this point. That supposedly he was in his office working. Tammy came down, or down the stairs, or he went down the stairs to check on her. Anyway, she was sick and she was throwing up, and she said, "Oh, I think I'm feeling better now." He said, "Great," and he went to keep working. And then she goes to bed. He comes back to bed around 1 a.m. and finds her dead. That was the version that Chad told Hannah's father. And that one actually tracks a little more. I still don't think it's entirely accurate. I don't think Tammy was sick at all. Then when she goes to the line with her mother, about 2 hours later, he tells a different story to her mother, and one that's far more compassionate sounding. And I'm wondering if Chad was like, oh, that didn't quite elicit the response I thought. Maybe I should massage the story a bit. And then the version he tells her mother is a little bit closer to what we've heard up to this point. That Tammy was sick and he was so concerned, and she was just throwing up and he's cleaning it up. I can't picture Chad ever cleaning up anything. Supposedly he and Tammy went to bed at the same time, and then he woke up at midnight when her dead body fell out of the bed. That's the story he kind of was telling up to this point, and we've still heard. That's kind of what he told the coroner, how a dead body moves on its own. And of course now he says, oh, when I pulled the sheets, that must have knocked her body loose. And then the coroner now admits she understands that that's ludicrous too. That would take a lot of effort of yanking for that to happen. Rigor mortis had already settled in, so she had been passed for a couple of hours already at least. This is where the whole thing with the does Chad's house have stairs? That's where it began, and we'll get to that in a second. But this testimony where it started, and it just won't stop. It's the question that Pryor will not let go. Ah! Hannah talks about how it seems so odd to her that Chad would just turn on the waterworks. Like if her father was suddenly getting emotional, Chad would get emotional, and then if her dad stopped crying, boom, suddenly Chad's tears are gone. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about the stairs. So she remembers Chad talking about going down the stairs, and very specifically down the stairs. And then Pryor's like, well, are you aware that the house is actually a one-level home? And she's like, I've never been there. I don't have any idea. My thought was maybe she heard down and assumed stairs, and maybe it was down the hall or something like that. He was pushing this hard as if he was trying to discredit her entire testimony. And the irony being that most of the house is one level, but there is an addition to it. And this came up the next day in court. It did not come up that day, and I'll explain in a second on that. But the addition, for one thing, it's friggin' ugly. Like, just take a look at that thing. That's one ugly addition. Doesn't match anything. Piece of ugly but I remembered they called it the loft. And I was like, wait a minute. They arrived to serve the warrant on their property. Garth answered the door and said, oh, my dad's asleep in the loft. I'll go get him. That was a week or two ago. So we already knew there was a loft. Because I remember thinking, and I said this even in a video, what was he doing sleeping in a loft instead of the main bedroom of the home? So we knew there was a loft. But Pryor kept pushing on this whole thing. And yet Pryor knows this house. He owns it, remember? He knows there's a loft. And a picture of the house was even shown last year in Lori's trial, showing this addition that has a second story to it. And then he tries to make it sound like, oh, there's no utilities in it, which we find out in the next day that yes, there actually were. Well, why didn't the prosecution pushed back? Because they know that there were stairs in the loft addition. This is the prosecution's case right now. They put out their witnesses and their evidence, and then the defense, they get to do their cross-examination. And that's when, oh, are there stairs, are there not, came up. And it's only new things that come up in cross that the prosecution can use to ask more questions of a witness in redirect. And there was no way to push back with this witness because she'd never been to the house. She didn't know. They can't ask her more questions of facts because she has no other facts to give. So they had nothing on redirect. They couldn't. So I knew that they would be bringing in evidence of stairs at some point, but just not that day because there's nothing they could have done to push back. It is the question that will not die. Then it was her mother, Patricia, who then who was Tammy's cousin, who then testified. She told the story, the same story that Hannah said that Chad told her about how Tammy had died, the one that's a little more compassionate. Then she said there were some things from the funeral that really bothered her. And when I heard what she said, my mouth dropped, I gasped, and I just was like, oh my, Chad, you schmuck. All 5 of the children spoke. And so did Chad. He said that Tammy was, quote, difficult to live with and lazy. He's saying this over the pulpit at his wife's funeral to the entire congregation. That his wife was difficult to live with and lazy. Yeah, the woman who took late night fitness classes to stay healthy was lazy. The woman who always had the full-time job to bring in the benefits because you couldn't get off your butt and provide for your family while you're having affairs. She's the lazy one. She's the difficult one to live with. He's the one who is Mr. Passive-aggressive jerkwad who's emotionally abusive. He does this by being quiet and apparently meek. He doesn't confront, but he manipulates. And that is so incredibly disgusting and devious and just nasty. It pisses me off. And this, unfortunately, is, I think, something in the Latter-day Saint culture that we need to do better at. We get so focused on, oh, contention is of the devil. Let's be peacekeepers, that we try to avoid contention, forgetting that conflict is not contention. Problems happen in life, no matter what. Contention and conflict, again, not the same thing. Conflict is a problem, a challenge. Let's figure this out. Let's solve the problem. Contention is nasty, bitter fighting. Sometimes you have to step into conflict and resolve conflict to broker peace. That is peacemaking. A peacemaker, that's an active verb. It's not someone who sits back and goes, well, I don't want to cause contention. I see so many members of the church doing that very thing because they don't want to be accused of bringing conflict and contention. So they sit back and do nothing and just kind of sit on their hands and hope the right thing happens. And these are largely good people. In theory, they're not killing people like Chad was, but it's that mentality that allows people like Chad, I think, to get away with what he has gotten away with up to this point. Because no one suspects the quiet guy. He's not being gregarious and loud and cussing people out. He's quietly manipulative. He's quietly having affairs on the side. He's quietly accusing his wife of being a horrible person and doing it under the guise of spirituality. Oh, your grandmother came to me and said you're being lazy and get off your butt and stop playing that video game. I didn't say it. Your grandma did. That is so manipulative and nasty, and goes right back also to the whole concept of stewardship, which we believe in, which means if Tammy's grandmother needed to come say something, she needed to come to Tammy, not to her husband. That's not how that's supposed to work. At the very least, Tammy would have had the right to receive confirmation of that revelation herself. And she was probably too afraid to pray about it and get the confirmation that no, your husband's a schmuck. This is, again, Patricia says, she said that at the funeral, Chad seemed to fake cry. And then when the children were sharing some anecdotes about their mother, there were a couple of times where Chad looked worried for a flicker, and then he would kind of awkwardly chuckle. We've seen and heard that awkward chuckle before. One was Emma talking about how her mother loved animals and pets and kind of would need to sneak them around so Chad didn't know that she had brought an animal into the house. And that's sad enough. The other one was even more concerning. This was when Garth said that sometimes he had to be the, quote, lookout while Tammy was playing a computer game, because if Dad came home and saw her playing, he'd get mad. So he had to be the lookout to make sure, to warn her if Dad's coming. I'm glad Garth said that, so that that's more evidence, though, that Chad was emotionally abusive. Pisses me off. Okay. Some of the testimony that we had on day 13 also kind of showed that Tammy and the children were aware of Chad's visions, even his light and dark scale on some level, of curses and cords, whatever he means by those things. They believed it to some extent. Even to the point of, in one of Tammy's emails to Mark, saying that, oh, well, Dad and I will pray harder because we feel like, Dad senses that there's some darkness that's being cursed in you on your mission. We'll pray harder for it to go away. In isolation, it's like, well, that's just weird. But again, with the whole picture of everything else, very alarming. Now, and this, we learned this from a sidebar or mini hearing thing outside of the jury's presence, whether this could be admitted as evidence, and Judge Boyce said it's hearsay, so no. So the jury won't hear this, but, and yes, it's hearsay. However, one of Tammy's coworkers reported overhearing Tammy talking to another coworker saying, oh yeah, Chad says I'm a zombie. I'm not a zombie. And part of me thinks that was a cry for help, because Tammy had heard her husband's preachings and probably knew what that meant on some level. Probably not to the level of, oh, he's going to kill me. That had to be disturbing, that her husband thought that she was a zombie. Or maybe she did think her life was in danger at that point. I don't know. The fact that Tammy and their children were aware of some of his teachings before Tammy died, to me, is clear evidence that Lori was not the primary driver of these events. It doesn't work to throw Lori under the bus and blame everything on her, because all of these things, not the affair itself, but all of the things that led to the murders and the murders themselves, were based on Chad's teachings. Lori went along with it, and she's evil for doing any of that, for planning any of it, and she will be behind bars for her part. But it's not all on her. It's all based on Chad's teachings. So I'm glad that came up. Day 14, we had, the day began with a medical examiner. So former chief medical examiner, he is now retired, Dr. Eric Christensen from Utah. And they went into what is an autopsy, how was one performed, all the different kinds of things that he did specifically. And they showed the photographs of the autopsy to the jury. They did not show them publicly. That the bruises that the coroner had thought just visually looked old were not, in fact, old. They were very new. And that the only thing abnormal about her body or any of her organs was that her lungs weighed a bit more. They were heavier than you would expect. However, she had pulmonary edema, which is swelling of the lungs caused by asphyxia. So that tracks. Her lungs were building up water because she was suffocated. On cross, Pryor kept trying to insist that she had had a seizure and died. She'd had a seizure and an embolism in her head, and that's why she died. And even though at one point Chad had told people she had died of a pulmonary embolism, I don't think Pryor understands what pulmonary means, or that an embolism can be in someplace besides the head. He's not the brightest bulb, as we know. He kept going back to, is it possible she could have had a seizure and that killed her? Dr. Christensen kept saying, that is not, basically no. I mean, there's the tiniest possibility, but there's something wrong that would cause a seizure. And she had nothing wrong with her. Then Pryor goes into discussing anemia, which he has brought up already, and he loves to just harp on anemia. That it showed up in Tammy's chart once. But then he's like, well, it never said she was cured of it. And I wanted to go, you're not cured of anemia. Anemia is something that can happen. It's a condition. You can be anemic one day and not the next. And I was grateful that Dr. Christensen actually said women often are anemic, especially if they have heavy periods. So during their period, they may be slightly anemic. That happens. And then when their periods finishes, then their body can build up those red blood cells again, and they're not anemic anymore. It's an ebb and flow kind of a situation. It's like your pulse can go up, and so can your blood pressure, and so can your red blood cell count. So I don't know why Pryor thinks that she could have died of anemia. As I've said before, yes, there are cases of pernicious anemia, things like that can cause other problems, but that is rare and clearly not what Tammy had. One mention one time in her medical files that she was anemic that day at the doctor's office has nothing to do with why she died. Give me a break. Pryor accidentally stepped into it again. So Tammy had more bruises on one arm. That was, most of them were on one side. And he's like, well, how would you do that if you're trying to restrain a person and suffocate them? How would you do that? Dr. Christensen said, well, if there's a second person, that would be pretty easy. And that's actually the prosecution's theory, that Alex was there. There were probably two people, one holding her down and the other suffocating her. So way to walk right into that one, Pryor. You doofus. Pryor also, he really enjoys asking experts why they didn't do X, Y, or Z when that's not part of their job. You know, he's asked detectives, well, why didn't you look into this cell phone data? And we have experts who look into cell data. That's literally not my job. Or then he would ask the cell phone expert, well, why didn't you look into this person's thing? And it's because I was not given that data. I was given certain data to look at, and that's what I analyze. He's always asking why people did or did not do something that is beyond the scope of their job. It is maddening. So he went off on Dr. Christensen about, well, why was Tammy dug up? He kept using that word. And, it was about Charles Vallow's death. That's what sparked it, huh? And the thing is that Dr. Christensen had nothing to do with the warrant that got the exhumation happening. He was told, find the cause of death of this deceased individual. So he did. So it was ridiculous. He kept just grilling him, and finally there were so many objections, and Boyce finally had to go, you need to stop with that question. Stop it. You're testifying, you're not asking a question, and you've already gotten the answer many times for the appropriate question. You need to move on. And it was pretty funny. I might play it for you at some point, but we're going to book it through some of this now in the interest of time. Then we had Alice Gilbert testify. She was part of their neighborhood and part of their ward, and she was Relief Society president of their ward, so the head of the women's organization, and Tammy was one of her counselors. So the way a presidency works in the church, and you'll find this in every organization, whether it's the young men or the children or the Relief Society, whatever, you'll have a president, and that president will then have two counselors, like two helpers, and then you'll often have a secretary who keeps records and that kind of thing. So Tammy was one of her counselors, which means they met regularly about the needs of the sisters in their ward and how to help them, and any concerns they had with whatever about the instruction on Sundays. I mean, they would have met at least once a week and known each other quite well. So when she heard that Tammy had died, she and her husband rushed over that morning, and they were shocked and just very upset. She went to the funeral in Utah from Idaho, and she got choked up on the stand saying she just needed to see Tammy. She needed to see her for closure. And she was emotional, but Chad was not. And she talked about how she didn't see him cry at all the day that Tammy died, that he was just emotionless, very matter of fact. And then later in her testimony, she mentions Chad coming to her and her husband, so this is March of 2020, begging for bond money to put their house up as collateral to bail his new wife out. And he tells them that Jesus sent me and says that you're supposed to give me the money. And he's crying. My poor wife, my poor Lori, my wife, she can't handle being in jail. I have to get her out. He's crying over Lori being in jail, but he did not shed a tear over Tammy dying. That's right there. That's almost all you need to know. Like, yeah, he killed her. The idea of saying, oh, Jesus sent me and says that you need to give me money. Like, can I do a big enough eye roll on that? I don't even know. Alice Gilbert also talks about how when Chad brought Lori over for them to meet, and how they actually wanted to go to their house to meet, and Chad says, no, we'll come to yours. And she said that the their physical affection was uncomfortable, like they were teenagers. It felt like way inappropriate for our just neighbors to be seeing. They actually were showing off their wedding pictures. Like he wanted to show all the wedding pictures, which only had, of course, Lori and Chad. None of the children, no family were there. They didn't know it was happening. And she said that not only was it upsetting that he got married so quickly after Tammy's death, but the fact that he's so excited about these photographs. And to me, I thought, well, hello, sociopath. He can't grasp what's a normal human emotion that somebody else would go, that's disturbing. It doesn't even cross his mind. He can't understand that's inappropriate. The showing off your wedding pictures when your dead wife is barely cold in the ground might be questionable. Yeah. Back to Pryor trying to push the narrative that Chad drove the Dodge truck. And so, so tell us about how you know that Chad would go to the church every day with his car and study. And she goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. We find out later with Heather Daybell's testimony that he did go to the chapel. He'd go to the church building apparently and try to work, not study, but he would try to write there. And that's actually against policy. The chapel is locked up unless there's an activity going on, which would normally be in the evening. Sometimes there'll be a morning something, but that's relatively rare. Like if it's a brunch activity for Relief Society or maybe some exercise thing going on in the gym. But generally the chapel is locked during the week. And so if Chad is going there on a regular basis, he's probably stealing Tammy's key to do so. Because the Relief Society presidency would probably all have keys. Not always. The president would, but her counselors might, especially in a more rural area, if there might be a need to have more people being able to access it in emergencies or whatever. But so Chad was probably using Lori or Tammy's key to get into the chapel and then using, say, the Wi-Fi or just the quiet or whatever to work by himself. And you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to use church property for things like that. That's annoying. And Heather did say that when she did see his car there, it was his car. It wasn't the Dodge Dakota truck. And again, Pryor can't seem to wrap his brain around the idea that a woman can drive a truck and might prefer it. How about that? Once more, the stairs come up. This time, the prosecution is asking Alice Gilbert if she has been inside the Daybell home and if she knows if there's stairs. And then Pryor objects. Why? He was the one bringing up the stairs constantly before yesterday. Of course, it's overruled. Rob Wood is on the prosecution. He said something or other about, were you aware that da-da-da? And Pryor jumps in with objection, speculation. And the irony with that, I don't even remember if that objection was sustained. It might have been. A huge chunk of what Pryor does in his questioning is, were you aware? And he's been called out on it, and he's had so many objections and been sustained on those objections, saying, your counsel is testifying, you need to question the witness, you need to, I was just asking if they were aware. And so suddenly he's objecting when the prosecution is doing the same thing he's done 100 times already. It was so silly. Once Alice Gilbert finished her testimony, her husband Todd got up very briefly, gives basically very similar things confirmed. Some basic things, said that Chad was a very quiet person. And I thought, Pryor is trying to make him sound like it was meek and humble and kind. And I'm thinking, no, he was quiet and a sociopath. He didn't have normal emotion, and he didn't have the charisma that a lot of sociopaths have, but he also didn't have the normal emotion either. So he just was quiet. But one thing I thought hilarious is that going back to the loft and the stairs, Pryor tried to make it sound like with Alice that, there were no utilities at all in the loft. And that was one of the "are you aware" moments. But Todd says, there was electricity at least. And it makes sense because Alice had just said there was a ham radio up there. How would that work? Ham radios aren't small. That's a setup. You'd need electricity for that. And if anyone is sleeping up there, which we know Chad has done, because that's where he was sleeping when the cops showed up, you'd want heating in there as well at a minimum, because Rexburg gets very cold. So I don't know where Pryor's getting this whole no utilities thing. Unless Chad is considered utilities like sewer, if there's not a bathroom or running water in there. But I would be very surprised if there wasn't at least heating, and we know there's electrical. He confirmed what his wife had said, that Chad volunteered the information that, oh, Lori's daughter didn't like him. She's dead now anyway. He admitted that, yeah, Lori's daughter died and she didn't like me anyway. And that, again, you're like, hi, Mr. Sociopath. You don't understand what's normal and appropriate, do you? That normal humans don't do that. You idiot. You psycho evil man. He keeps going back to the idea that Tammy was sick. And so far, there's no one that can corroborate that, including some of the insurance people. Talked to Taylor Ballard, who's an insurance broker, and she said that Chad came to her to get medical insurance for himself and at least Garth, and probably Mark when he came off his mission, because that day or the day after, Tammy's policy was expiring. And Chad then lied about his income, and he asked about adding a spouse someday, even though he was already remarried. And she's like, well, we can cross that bridge when that happens. He didn't understand, though, that there's a window. Once you get married, you have to claim your spouse within this certain window to have them added to the policy. But then he paid on December 11th for this medical insurance, ironically the day before Tammy's body was exhumed. And then he came in months later in March to try to get Lori added to the policy. And he was very concerned because she's in jail and she's going to need medical insurance. And, Ms. Ballard said, actually, if she's in jail, she won't know, the state will take care of that. And at one point when they were discussing his income, he said, well, this is how he put it. They confiscated my computer, so I haven't been able to pay myself. And she said, who was they? And he says, the FBI. And that's when she's like, okay, what? You said what now? And this is before the children had been found. And there were, a lot of red flags just left and right. She said that when she was running Lori's information, it wasn't coming up because Chad had given her name as Lori Ryan Daybell. She was no longer Lori Ryan. She was Lori Fallow, and I don't think her name had been officially changed to Daybell. So, of course, Lori Ryan Daybell, that person doesn't exist. Then day 15, Kay Woodcock testifies first. She is JJ's biological grandmother and legal aunt because her brother Charles adopted him from her own son. Her own son had baby JJ with his girlfriend, couldn't take care of him, and then Kay's brother Charles adopts him with Lori. So legal aunt, biological grandmother. Interestingly, a little tidbit here from Lori's trial, with Idaho law, that victims of murders get to give a victim impact statement, and they then have to define who those victims are. And they say that it is immediate family as defined as da 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 da. And I believe grandparents are not considered immediate family. But Kay still qualified to give a victim impact statement because she was his aunt through Charles, because Charles is her brother. But Larry Woodcock was not allowed to give a victim impact statement, and my understanding of that is because they weren't technically married anymore. They had married and divorced. They were still living together, but there is not a common law exception situation. And because she was biologically the aunt through Charles, Larry wasn't, they were no longer married, that Larry didn't have a legal right to be a victim. That's my understanding, that they've since remarried. And I wonder if part of that is just the technicality that he now is considered the, family again. There was one moment in Kay's testimony where there was an objection of some kind, and she gave a little snort, kind of like an audible eye roll almost. And I just was like, oh, okay. It was fantastic. And Pryor almost seemed to insinuate that Kay might have been somehow involved in Charles's murder because she was the beneficiary of his life insurance, even though Charles had told her that if something happens to him, he might be changing it. But that was the end of it. She didn't know for sure that he had changed the beneficiary from Lori to her until after he died, and the insurance company then contacted her. And yet he's saying, oh, but you benefited from his death. And I just kept thinking that you're not winning any points with the jury with that kind of thing. This is a grieving grandmother. And you're telling her that she might be culpable in her brother's murder. Like, dude, seriously? Like, no. Prior, he's nothing if not inconsistent and stupid. He objects. Kay had access to Charles's accounts because he had his own business stuff, and sometimes Kay helped him with payroll and some other things. And so she ended up logging into his Amazon account and seeing that Lori had purchased wedding rings and had been browsing for linen beach clothes, which is the kind of thing that Chad wore in their wedding pictures. And as they're going through some of this, Pryor objects, and he's like, it's speculation. We don't know it was Lori that was doing this browsing. And technically, I guess it could have been Chad or maybe Lori's friend, or you're right. We don't know technically that it was Lori. We know that the only two people who had access to that account were Kay and Lori, and Kay is looking at it and discovering this information. But okay, technically, do we know it was Lori? No. So he objects. Speculation, fine, it's sustained. But then when he gets up on cross, he starts referring to, well, when Lori was doing these searches. I just thought, oh my gosh, dude, you just objected to the idea that we know it's Lori, and now you're stating that it's Lori. Make up your mind. And he also clearly doesn't know how the internet works or even how Amazon works, because he was saying, well, you can see a browsing history, but you don't know when someone searched for something. And Kay say, actually, you can see exactly when you searched for it. Oh, you can? Okay, then we had a couple more relatively brief witnesses. Angela Yancey spoke. She did payroll and benefits in the school district where Tammy lived, and they went through all kinds of stuff about the policies and when Tammy could up the amounts of this and that, and some of the red flags that she saw. She thought it was very strange. The upping insurance in and of itself, again, in isolation, not a weird thing. But the fact that Chad came in 48 hours after Tammy's death, the first weekday that they were open, wanting to get the payout from the life insurance, that was alarming. And then on top of that, when she was like, well, we have to get a death certificate before we can process the claim. And then he says, oh, that's fine. I ordered 8 of them. Like, as again, like, hi, Mr. Sociopath. Like, number one, why would you volunteer that kind of information? And also, why are you ordering so many? Like, maybe you have a reason for it, but that seems awfully high. So she said that was a strange thing that stuck out to her, as well as the fact that he came in so quickly, because oftentimes she's the one going, oh, there was a death in the district, and then she has to, within a few weeks, go, oh, I need to find a family member, the beneficiary, and tell them that there's this life insurance policy. That people don't usually come in on their own and say, give me the money. She has to go find them. 2 other little fascinating notes from Angela Yancey. The paperwork that Chad filled out to get the payout had, one of the questions was, when did the health problems of the deceased first appear? And he put down the day before Tammy died. So much for the theory that she has been sick for weeks or months, that she was slowly declining and wouldn't see a doctor. Literally, he put the first sign of any illness was the day before she died, which, again, I don't think she was sick even then. He's making that up. Ha! So there goes the defense's argument. Then Pryor made himself look really stupid again by implying that the school district makes money when their employees increase their life insurance. The school district is not the one providing the life insurance. They don't make money off of that. That's not how this works. Chad's mother, Sheila, testified very briefly. She talked about one of the last times that she saw Tammy was at a baby blessing. And baby blessings have come up a couple of times. Heather Daybell mentioned one as well. So I thought I'd just really briefly explain what that is in a Latter-day Saint context. We have what they call saving ordinances, and then there's ones that are not saving ordinances. Saving ordinances are ones that are considered necessary for salvation, like baptism. Other ones that are not saving, but they're sacred or still important, would be like the sacrament, which is like our communion on Sunday. So another one is the baby blessing, and that would be somewhat be equivalent in the sense of, say, a christening done when a child is an infant, and that is when they're given an official name that will go on the records of the church, and then the father. Usually it's the father doing it, not always, but pronouncing the name of the child, and then a blessing for them over the course of their lifetime. So it's kind of a sweet time, and that's a time when family often will get together and travel to be there and have a little meal and that kind of thing. So that's what Sheila was talking about. Anyway, she talks about a dinner that she and her husband had with Chad and Lori. I believe she said it was November 13th of 2019. That is when she learned that they were married, and that was a shock. And she was a little dismayed that she hadn't known about it, and that they just went off to Hawaii and did it. And Lori is the little chatterbug going off about their little wedding, and Chad, as is him, stayed quiet. That is Chad's MO. That's what he does. He doesn't rock the boat. He could be a murderer, and he's not going to say much of anything because he slides into the radar that way. Lori reiterated the story that she had a daughter who died, which she had told to the Gilberts and others as well. Yeah, she had her daughter killed and dismembered and burned. And yet she's getting sympathy from other people over it. At one point, Pryor asked Sheila to describe Chad's personality, but then he actually was providing a descriptor. And he began by saying, well, see, he, meaning Chad, he's not never mind. I'll ask that differently. He's not aggressive. So he wanted to take that word back. He didn't quite get it all the way out, but he wanted to take that word back. He also tried to say that because Chad is a writer, that automatically makes him a hermit type person and an introvert. No. I know a good chunk of writers are introverts. I know many who are not. So that's just a weird, I don't know where you're getting that from, dude. Then Heather Daybell got on the stand, and I was stoked for her testimony. If you have not seen the Hidden True Crime interview that she did, is the only one that she's done. Very long. It's in 3 parts, 6 hours. Go watch that. It's fascinating and intense, and I have mad respect for her. Thanks to some of these events, she's left the church, and I cannot blame her for that. She was the Stake Relief Society president at the time of all of this, which means that she is the highest level you could get as a woman in a stake, which is, as I've mentioned before, is the Latter-day Saint equivalent to a Catholic diocese, sort of. So you've got several wards, and then several wards make up a stake. So she's Stake Relief Society president. So she was trying to sound the alarm to the stake leaders, saying something is wrong with my brother-in-law, Chad. She's married to Chad's brother. And she's like, he's teaching things that are not in line with the gospel. He's trying to spread these ideas of visions and stuff. And she brings up what I have said many times already on this channel, that Chad was violating one of our big tenets, or in that we believe that if you receive, answers from the other side, spiritual impressions, revelation, whatever you want to call it, it is only valid within the scope of your stewardship. So if you have, Chad would have no right to be receiving visions that would apply to the entire world. That's not way beyond the scope of his stewardship. And Heather knew that. That is not okay. They weren't listening to her. The leaders were like, he's quirky. She's like, no, there's more to it than that. And Chad starts trying to say, well, your land is going to be part of this end of the world movement. And she's like, get off my land. He's trying to tell her children, one of her sons even, saying, You're going to be a leader in this final apocalyptic whatever. And she goes, keep your teachings away from my children. Chad's father apparently at one point called her a pot stirrer, like she's trying to stir up the pot, cause problems. At one point, Chad said, "You've always been a problem to me for my entire life." And she's like, "I haven't known you my entire life. What are you talking about?" But I have, again, mad respect. She did not want them moving to Rexburg because he was dancing on the edge of really weird, fringy stuff, and she didn't want to be associated with him in a tiny town. They moved to Rexburg largely themselves, Heather and her husband, to kind of have a little bit of distance and some independence. That they knew that would be good for their family. And then Chad and they move up and just encroach on all of that, not only moving to the same town, but to the same ward. And Heather was not thrilled about that. She also got the impression that Tammy didn't want the move. And so she invited them over to come to their house and chat. And she wanted to ask Tammy how she felt about it all. And of course, Chad had to be there because that's Chad. And he told Heather, ask your questions of me. Don't ask Tammy because you'll only get her upset. And Heather says, Tammy is a grown woman, so I asked her those questions. I ignored Chad. And it pissed him off. And his quiet little, I'm going to simmer and be pissed off quietly way. But he was not happy. And I think that was when he said, "You've always been a problem to me my whole life." When she first got up there, Boyce always says, "Well, if you watched or seen anything about the trial, because if so, you may not be able to testify." She said no. But then they had a sidebar and he comes back and says, "Okay, well, under Idaho law, we've looked at some of the case law and we've determined that she is considered a victim, so the exclusionary rule does not apply to her." And I thought, well, then she could have been here this whole time. And her husband actually came to trial the day before and the same day, and he said he was there to support Kay and Larry Woodcock, not his brother. That's all he would say to the media. And I imagine he was also there to support his wife. But there was a moment the day before Heather testified when he came to court, and Chad caught his eye. You can see it on camera where Chad actually kind of goes, "Hey," like, "Oh, there you are. Hey," as if he's like, "Oh, you're supporting me. Thanks." And like, no. When all of this first went down, when Tammy first died, Heather knew something was off. She and her husband were in Las Vegas, she said, at some conference that her husband was going to attend. And he was really mad when Heather says, "I think Chad did something to Tammy." And her husband was just so mad at the idea, how could you accuse my brother of something like that? But Matt has since come around. A churchy thing I wanted to clarify, because what is an executive secretary has come up a couple of times. Chad was an executive secretary. This is something that there's a misconception even among a lot of members. An executive secretary is not part of the bishopric. To clarify that. And the bishopric is the bishop, the leadership of the ward. And it's called bishopric, like Bishop Rick. But Pryor has struggled. Every time he says the word, it's like, it sounds like a chakra. He's like, bishopric, or I don't know, it's weird. But Bishop Rick, that's how you say it. The bishopric is composed of the bishop and 2 counselors, like all the other presidencies I already talked about. And that's it. That's the bishopric. Then they can call other people to help. So you have your executive secretary, sometimes an assistant executive secretary. You have a financial clerk that handles the donations. You'll have the membership clerk that handles the member records. But those people are not part of the bishopric itself. And that's in the handbook. I can read that for you if you want. In the interest of time, I won't bother. But yeah, the executive secretary is not officially part of the bishopric. And that actually is probably one thing that really frustrated Chad, because he was never in a bishopric and he wanted to be. So to him. Earlier in the trial, I'm forgetting which witness it was with, but Pryor was like, "Oh, so the executive secretary is like the closest to the bishop. Like they're really tight." And I wanted to go, no. The executive secretary would show up in all the meetings and take notes and be the bishop's gopher or whatever. But when it came to being really close, it would be his counselors. Those are the ones that would consult with him and be more privy to all of any sensitive information, more so than the executive secretary. So just to clarify that. Heather is so 100% right when she said the male leaders would not listen to her. And despite the fact the prior actually even says, well, let's get real. You had like a lot of authority as the Stake Relief Society president. And she said, not authority, no. And I wanted to stand up and cheer because there is a difference between being a leader in certain capacities and actually having authority. And unfortunately, women in the church don't really have authority to do much of anything without a man's acceptance or approval. Things are shifting in that regard in a lot of ways, but it's slow. It's a very, very slow process. I've seen a lot in the last 30 years, but it's glacial, it feels like sometimes. Something else that she mentioned about Tammy's funeral that was disturbing was the fact that the opening hymn was "Put Your Shoulder to the Wheel." Let me play a little bit for you, because this hymn, it's very cheerful, and it's also about work. Get off your butt and work, essentially, and don't cheerfully work. That's not something you normally would hear at a funeral. You would normally hear, God be with you till you meet again. I believe in Christ. Come thou fount of every blessing. How great thou art. I mean, something like that. Some, awe-inspiring, emotionally touching song. Not, Tammy, you're a lazy, get off your butt and work now that you're dead. So here's part of it. Put your shoulder to the wheel, push along. Do your duty with a heart full of song. We all have work, let no one shirk. Put your shoulder to the wheel. That's put your shoulder to the wheel. Push along. Yeah. That was Chad's final message to her. Put your shoulder to the wheel. And he tells Heather that Tammy died of an embolism because she had gained 40 pounds. I've talked about the body shaming of Tammy, which is ironic since Chad was not exactly in shape himself. He's lost a lot of weight, first thanks to Lori, who wanted to impress her, and then jail food, probably. But those who have seen Tammy's autopsy photos and her death scene photos can attest Tammy was not overweight. There's any problem with that if she had been, but she wasn't. She hadn't suddenly gained 40 pounds. And even if she had, how dare he blame something like that? I mean, oh my goodness, she was dealing with coercive control, manipulation, narcissistic sociopathy. That if she had gained 40 pounds because she was feeding her emotions because she didn't have a husband who gave a crap, and she was finding some solace in some Rocky Road ice cream, I wouldn't blame her. It just... Pryor also brings up to Heather that one of the detectives, retired now, Dave Hope, happens to be, we can get this straight, Heather Daybell's daughter's father-in-law. And somehow Pryor likes to make that sound as if it's a conflict of interest. She hardly knows the guy. Like they happen to, there might be an occasional family event that might include her both sides of her daughter's family, but that, no. But Pryor also got the relationship wrong. She goes, your brother-in-law. She goes, no, my daughter's father-in-law. At one point we learned that he withdrew an objection for a new exhibit. And we find out that it was a photograph of, you called it, the stairs. And the fact that he withdrew his objection, that probably put some tallies in the wrong side for the jury, as far as he's concerned. I wanted to finish off with a thought, because it's significant to me. This is one of those things that you have to wonder, what if? What if something else had happened, and could this have been prevented? What if, when Heather had raised the alarm, the leaders had listened and not thought, wow, Chad's just a little quirky, but thought, no, Chad is potentially dangerous. What if they had listened to her and did a little bit of digging? What if they had done that and realized that he was having an affair and had excommunicated him then, before Tammy and Tylee and JJ and Charles died? Let's finish up with a few words from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. Talked about how when Christ was resurrected, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. And then she went and told them that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. Verse 11, and they, when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, believed not. When he appeared unto them, unto the 11, as they sat at meat, and he upbraided them. Basically, he chewed them out. He scolded them with their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they believed not. 2,000 years later, we're still not believing women. Listen to women. Pay attention. Don't just brush them off. If they had listened to Heather Daybell when she raised the alarm, we might still have Charles and Tammy and Tylee and JJ. That is, to me, a particularly difficult pill to swallow. Kudos to Heather. Thank you for your courage and your bravery and your honesty, your willingness to step forward and speak to Tammy, not to Chad, to stand up to the arrogance of Mr. Passive-aggressive, narcissistic sociopath Chad, and to be the hero, even though nobody listened to you. In the meantime, go get yourself some chocolate to get through all of this bitter.